I'm Dalton Dale, a music enthusiast on a mission to learn about my favorite genre, heavy metal. Join me as I listen through and learn about the history of heavy metal music. We'll be talking about bands, albums, songs, and historical events that helped create the metal music genre as we know it today. This is the Hevolution Podcast. Hey everyone, what's going on? Welcome to this week's edition of the Hevolution Podcast. I am your host, Dalton Dale. Glad to be back. I took a little bit of a break. Kids were on spring break, decided to spend some time with the family. Not that I'm not normally spending time with the family, but just a little extra time away from recording and research and all of that kind of stuff. So it was good to take a step back, but glad to be here. Today's episode is dropping on my birthday. Happy April Fool's Day. Go play a good joke on somebody. It's a good day. I hope you had a good weekend. Maybe you spent some time with family. Maybe not. That's okay. Either way, I hope you've had a good few weeks. Make sure to check out the merch store. I have loaded that thing up with t-shirts and hoodies and crew necks. And even in the last week, I've wanted to do this for a while. It's an outdoor brand. I'm not going to drop names. I don't want to cause issues here, but it's inspired by a popular outdoor brand, and it's a new tank top. I've got it up in the store, fresh for summertime. Weather's getting warmer where I'm at, and it's going to be starting to get warmer for most everybody around the country. So it's perfect time to stock up on some new tanks. So go check it out. You can find links for that on my socials, Facebook page. It's a lengthy email or lengthy website address, so I'm not going to try to put it here, but go find it on social. You can find it on my link tree and get to it there. So let's get into it. Right now, I am in a transition phase. So I'm currently transitioning out of power metal from the early 80s, and I'll be working my way into the black metal period of the 80s. And in power metal, we covered several bands and albums that I feel like and helped define the sound and style of power metal. These are bands and albums that stylistically really helped carve out that specific niche, which was a very solid segue to move us from early American heavy metal and then into what will become mid 80s thrash metal. So they were bordering and playing around with speed, and they were playing around with some different lyrical content than what was more prominent for early American heavy metal bands like Motley Crue and Van Halen and some of those. And we're really trying to kind of push the boundaries for what this new style of music could do. It's been a lot of fun. I've had some really interesting listens and have really shared a lot. This was bands like Savatage, Merciful Fate, Warlock, Jagdpanzer, Anthrax. I mean, all of these were bands that were really critical to helping continue to define and shape the sound of heavy metal for years to come. So as I move out of that, we're going to transition into black metal of the 80s. And that's heavy metal that's inspired and focused on themes about Satan and the occult. That's one of the biggest aspects to it stylistically and sound wise. It's going to move into a very different sort of sound, a much darker sound. But as well, I think you'll hear some sounds and styles that are even consistent with some of the bands that we've already listened to. But there's a definite difference in the overall just the big picture of it that end up kind of separating it into its own genre. And we'll dig into more of that as I go into my first episode on black metal. I'll share a little bit about what that is, what makes it different, and why it's so important. But there are going to be some aspects to it that I think will help shape a lot of what's to come after that. Things like death metal, and then even further down the road, maybe some metalcore and deathcore. Just some of those, doom and sludge. There's just a lot of those that come out of sounds and styles that were really prominent for black metal. So before that transition, I wanted to take some time to cover an album and a band that I personally enjoyed. Now, when I say I personally enjoy, this isn't a band that I just go to and listen to a lot. But it is a band that I discovered about a year and a half ago that I have found to really enjoy. They are very talented. And as far as early heavy metal goes, early 80s heavy metal goes, I think that this is one band that often gets overlooked unless you really talk to the diehard heavy metal fans, the guys who were there. This is one that, my dad knew. This is one that when I pose it to a group of heavy metal fans from the 80s, several people know of them, but it's not one of the more popular heavy metal bands from that period. And I think they often get overlooked. And for me, I wanted to take a moment to do an album that I felt a little bit more personally invested into outside of just the project of studying heavy metal. So, for the past few weeks, I've been listening to Armored Saint and their debut album, March of the Saint. The reason I chose this band and album is that I feel like John Bush is criminally underrated and not talked about nearly enough in conversations when you're talking about the best early 80s heavy metal vocalists. John is so good. He is such a powerhouse. I had the opportunity to see these guys in concert about a year and a half ago, which is when I discovered them. And dude, he freaking kills it, man. He is absolutely insanely talented. And I think stylistically, he's got one of the better sounding vocals from this time period than I would say even most of the vocalists that I'd recently covered in the power metal segment. So, was really, really looking forward to just pulling through this album and digesting as much of it as I could, and then sharing that back with you guys. So it's going to be a relatively short episode today, but I'm excited to share with you what I've learned. We're going to take a quick break, and I will be back with you in just a moment. Today's episode is brought to you by a new track from my good friends in Glass Lotus. Glass Lotus is a local metalcore band here where I'm at, and they shred hard. I got to watch them perform a few weeks back. I've seen them play several times, and they absolutely kill it. They've got a new song out now. It's called The Sound. I'm going to play a little bit for you here in just a moment. It's awesome. This is for fans of Invent Anime, Silent Planet. They've got that sort of modern new metalcore sound, and it is a whole vibe, and I'm about it. So here's a little snip from that new track. It is out now. Listen to it wherever you listen to music. All right, welcome back. I'm going to get started here with some quick hits, and then we will move into some notes on the album and the track specifically. So, quick hit number one, John Bush. He's the vocalist for Armored Saint. As I mentioned, I feel like he's vastly underrated. He auditioned for and was nearly the lead singer for Metallica. When Metallica was first starting out and then they were starting to get popular, they were not sold on James doing vocals. Lars and the rest of the band, they felt like they wanted somebody who could just do vocals and not play guitar and do vocals. And James was a defining factor for them as a guitar player in the band. So even James himself, he didn't even want to do vocals. And so they were auditioning various singers for the part. John was at the top of that list. Ultimately, he ended up saying, I want to commit to Armored Saint and pursuing that opportunity instead. It is wild, though, to think about what would Metallica be had they not gone with James as vocalist. Would Metallica have become who they are? Would Metallica sound the way that they sound if they had had a different vocalist? And I think that that's all a very fun what if sort of game to play, this sort of alternate universe where John Bush is the lead singer of Metallica. And heck, I would think it would be fun to even just listen to John do vocals for some Metallica songs in one of their concerts. I think if James is ever not feeling well on a tour, they need to call John immediately and get him on vocals, because I think that would be really freaking cool to listen to John do vocals for Metallica. Number two, quick hit number two. According to interviews with Joey Vera, the bassist, and John Bush, both of them are original members of the band. The first album, March of the Saint, cost them over $300,000 to make, and are, quote, still in debt for that one. That is mind-boggling to me. I don't know, this is quoted from an interview. So I didn't go look to see how accurate the production cost of this album was, but if it is in fact over 300,000, even if it's half of that, 150,000 in the early 80s, $150,000 for a full-length album is outrageous. That is such a large amount of money. It is crazy to me to think. So to me, it's wild that they ended up spending over that much. And the craziest part is that neither of them are happy with the finished product, as they felt it ended up having a much more commercialized sound due to the production and mix. They didn't like the producer, they didn't like the mixers, they did not like anything about it. And I'm pretty sure, I if I recall, I think the only song they played from this album was the hit track that ended up getting popularized by MTV, Can You Deliver? And when you go back and I went back and I listened to the album after finding that out. I need to go listen to other Armored Saints stuff by comparison, but there is a noticeably commercial sound to it. When I think about some of the LA bands that came out in the early 80s, the ones that got really popularized because of the MTV era and the video era that happened, there is a noticeable sound difference when you compare that with, for example, some of the power metal bands that were doing stuff at the same time. And I think ultimately the band wanted something that was more traditional heavy metal sounding. They wanted something that was maybe a little more raw and a little less polished. And I'll touch on that in a moment. There's a song I think that probably strikes as close as you can get to for that sound. But this was a really interesting fact to me that they really are not happy with how this album turned out. Quick hit number three. John Bush is most famous for his tenure with Anthrax, one of the power metal bands I covered, and one of the big four heavy metal bands out there. He left Armored Saint in the early 90s after getting an offer from Anthrax to sing for them after Joey Belladonna was fired from the band. This stint lasted until about 2005. It was about 13 years before Anthrax decided to bring Belladonna back. In that period, when they were bringing Belladonna back, it was really more of a, hey, let's do a little bit of a tour and we're going to sing some stuff from your period. I mean, again, it had been about 13 years since Belladonna was with the band and they had recorded anything with him. So they had felt like, all right, let's have an opportunity to bring this guy back. Let's go play some songs from that time period and let's see what happens. In that process, Belladonna declined even getting back together fully as a reunion. And at the same time, John Bush also had kind of said, you know what, with them bringing Belladonna back and wanting to do some of that, it didn't feel quite right to accept an offer and do anything with the band, with Anthrax at the time. And then he decided to kind of pick Armored Saint back up and really kind of see what they could do as a band and kind of pick that project back up. So, all right, we're going to take a quick break and I'll be back with you in just a moment. Hey everyone, just wanted to take a quick moment and just remind you about the Hevolution podcast playlist that I've got on Spotify. I've mentioned this in a few episodes before, but I just want to give a fresh reminder for any new listeners out there. If you head over to Spotify, you can just search for my personal profile, Dalton A. Dale, and I've got a customized playlist called the Hevolution podcast playlist, and it is filled with everything that I listen to for this podcast. It goes all the way back to when I started this out as just a TikTok page and runs it all the way through to this week's episode. So be sure to go check that out. You can follow it there. Again, just find my personal profile, Dalton A. Dale, and find my playlist, the Hevolution Podcast playlist, and you can follow along. We will get you right back to the episode. All right, welcome back. Let's get into the album here. So, Armored Saint, March of the Saint. March of the Saint was debuted on September 26, 1984. It was recorded at Ocean Way Recording and Clover Recording Studios in Hollywood, California, and it was released on the label Chrysalis label. Initially, Armored Saint was actually signed to Metal Blade Records, and then that's what they put their EP out on. And then they got signed by Chrysalis Records to do their full length. And then I think after this first full length, they ended up going back to Metal Blade. They weren't really quite happy with how the album turned out, as I mentioned, as well as the success of the album. So let's get into some of the tracks on the album. And, as always, go find this on the the Hevolution podcast playlist and listen for yourself, or wherever you listen to music. Go find the album and give it a listen. Tell me what you think on socials. The album opens with the title track, March of the Saint. It's got a very upbeat sort of punk rock beat to it. The drums are very straightforward through the track with a driving like kick snare beat. So it's a pretty typical like boom, ka, boom, ka, boom, ka, kind of beat to it. And the vocals on the chorus have almost more of a gang style vocal to it, which is a little bit more reminiscent of a more anthemic punk rock song. And I thought that that was a pretty interesting style and take on the vocals for the chorus. Following up to that track is Armored Saint, one of their classics. It's Can You Deliver? As I mentioned earlier, this was really the only hit from this album. It saw some minor success thanks to MTV. And I think it's a song about sex, which I guess says a lot. Sex sells, really. So, but it's a fairly standard 80s American heavy metal song. There's guitar solos with some wah pedal effects on the guitar work in the verses. And probably the most fascinating part to the song to me, aside from John's vocals, he shines on this song like all of them, but the bass guitar has a sort of a scale bass drive to it, and it sounds a lot more like bass guitar work from new wave of British heavy metal than what was more popular for American heavy metal at the time. So I really like that. Following that, Take a Turn. It's the album's ballad track. It is a very standard 80s heavy metal ballad about heartache and love. Not much that's super notable here, and it's fine. Take it or leave it. I'm not a big ballad guy. For most bands in this period, it was pretty common and typical. I think it was a means of highlighting their range and their skill set, especially early on. I think it helped bring a little bit more commercial appeal to the band whenever they would do a ballad. And I think a lot of producers and record labels would push heavy metal bands to do these ballads as a means of helping them branch out their audience, or maybe bring in some fresh audience for their songs and their albums. But for me, it's just not something that I'm particularly a fan of, even though it seems to span across, I think, almost any 80s heavy metal album of the time. Following that, the song Seducer. There's a very cool moment. It's at the 2 minute and 11 second mark. The main guitar on the bridge playing the main riff changes from playing sort of singular notes. So it's this. I'm gonna try to imitate it here for you. Just go listen to it. But if you just choose not to listen to it and only listen to this, here's my best example. It's like do 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 do. So very just it's like single plucked notes, nothing like super fancy to it. And then all of a sudden at that 2 minute and 11 second mark, they transition from singular string notes to power chords. And holy smokes, like I'd listened to this album a few times before this really caught my ear, and it completely changes the tone of the bridge. There is such a heavy atmosphere that comes with that change to power chords that the whole bridge, it just carries that whole bridge and in behind the guitar solo into a key change. It's just a really cool section of the song. To me, it has a almost like a later a sound that comes later, more with like hardcore elements to it, that that it's creates almost like a breakdown sort of vibe to it. It was really cool. I would say instrumentally, this was probably one of my favorite moments on the entire album. After that, you've got Mutiny on the World. By far, this is like the least polished heavy metal sound. I had mentioned earlier that the band did not like the sound and style of the whole album. They felt like it had a much more commercial sound to it than what they wanted. And I think, in my opinion, Mutiny on the World is probably a lot more what they had wanted the whole album to sound like. As well, it just sounds a lot more like how the band sounds live. So for me, I think that's where I connect the dots. Is I've having seen them live. This song to me probably translates a little bit better into what I bet they wanted it to sound like versus what most of the album does sound like. And I think overall, it helps add to the sound that the song is an anti government track. I mean, it's just it is probably the most heavy metal track on the album, in my opinion. Follow that up with a song called Glory Hunter. This one is very power metal. I initially part of the reason I got drawn to Armored Saint for this transition album here is they teeter into a little bit of power metal in terms of themes and style. I think that they don't quite dip totally over that, and I think some of that could maybe be, now learning about the production of this album, some of that could end up being just because of how this was mixed and produced. But I do think that thematically, I mean, Armored Saint, it was picked up from having seen something about Excalibur and all of that. So you've got sort of that medieval kind of theme coming in just in the name of the band. And then if you go look at the album cover, it's knights in front of a castle. So again, there are some themes here consistent with this band that are consistent with power metal. But to me, Glory Hunter is I think you could take that and drop it into a lot of different power metal albums, and I think it would fit very well. To me, this is seemingly about a fierce warrior who is feared by all the nations around. The sound and style transitions from this sort of atmospheric power metal style in the verses to almost an LA heavy metal sounding chorus. And to me, it's kind of a unique composition of styles. And I think some of the instrumentals in the verses might be some of my favorite on the album in terms of just the whole of the sound that you get from the start of the track and then into that first chorus. I just think it's got a really unique vibe to it. And then you've got Stricken by Fate. This one, overall, this is easily probably the most polished and commercial sounding track on the album. It feels a lot like a new wave of British heavy metal soundtrack, which I think there was still that idea for record labels that that was the sound and style they needed to capture and pick up, because new wave of British heavy metal up to this point. I mean, again, this was 1983. Up to this point, the bands that had captured the most attention in the United States were new wave of British heavy metal. You've got, a few bands stateside that really kind of picked up some steam and did pretty well. But by and large, it was Judas Priest, it was Black Sabbath, it was, Iron Maiden. Those were the bands that were touring the US and selling out shows. So I think there was a draw by producers to want to make sound to want to make songs that sounded like that. The album closes with False Alarm. To me, this is probably the second or third most memorable track on the album outside of Can You Deliver. But the vocal work on the track is some of John's finest work that I've listened to. So those of you that are bigger fans than me, go tell me what's better than this. But what I've listened to, this is some of John's finest work, and I think this song really showcases his range. You've got screamy shouts to high range sort of yells to melodic vocal runs and kind of everything in between. And overall, it's just a really solid closing track. So those are my thoughts on the album. March of the Saint, Armored Saint, September 1984. Go listen to it. Again, you can find that on the Hevolution podcast playlist. playlist on Spotify. Just search for me, Dalton A. Dale, and find the Hevolution Podcast playlist, or search the Hevolution Podcast, and you should be able to find it that way as well. I want to thank you all for joining me today. I really appreciate it. I hope you have a great day. Take some time, leave a 5-star review. That is so, so important for brand new podcasts. It helps me get into charts, it helps me get seen in searches, and it helps just in general. It helps me so, so much. Even if you don't like it, even if you hated it today, leave a 5-star review and tell me how much you hated it. But share this on socials. Go find me. You can find me on Facebook, the Hevolution Podcast, and TikTok at Hevolution Pod. I post little clips and some different videos there. So be sure to check it out. Find me there. Let's engage and interact. You can also send me an email, hevolutionpodcast@gmail.com. I thank you all. I hope you have a great week. We will see you next time.